Well, hello there, team, and welcome to an update on the situation in Iceland. I'm Geology Professor Shawn Willsey. Today is Friday, March 1st. It is 10:30 a.m. here Mountain Standard Time, about 5:30 p.m. in Iceland. And welcome. We're going to dissect what's been happening the last few days since our drone flight and live stream on Wednesday. A few scientific happenings, some news and notes. Just kind of, I think a lot of people are eagerly and maybe not eagerly, but anticipating this possible and likely eruption that is expected to take place any day now, essentially. So we'll go ahead and get started. Right as of this recording, the eruption has not started, but again, it is anticipated and considered imminent. I want to first give a little shout out to my wife because today is March 1st, and today is a holiday that she came up with and has instituted. So in our house, March 1st is Toe Freedom Day. My wife does not like wearing shoes and socks. In fact, when we got married, she walked down the aisle looking beautiful in her dress and in her bare feet. So she has decided that every year on March 1st, as winter sort of comes to a close, that March 1st should be good enough to let the warmer weather come back in, and she declares her toe freedom by wearing sandals on March 1st. So, in support of her and her holiday, I too am wearing sandals here, even though it's cold and rainy out here in Idaho. So, wherever you are, that might be a holiday that you want to adopt and incorporate. Obviously, if you're in a place like Australia, this is your going into your I guess your fall or so, so it makes sense. But anyway, happy Toe Freedom Day if you're so inclined. So you can see it's a beautiful day in Iceland right now. Looking at some of the webcams from live from Iceland, they've got three cameras fixed on different parts of the area where if we were to have an eruption anytime now, these would be the most likely places. So this is looking north from Grindavik towards this hill, Hagafelt. There's the road going up towards the airport, and the Blue Lagoon is right here. There's the greenhouse. This one here in the top right corner is from Thorbjorn, the big mountain or hill just to the northwest of Grindavik, and this is looking to the, I guess it's looking to the northeast. You can see the Spartsi power plant, a little bit of the Blue Lagoon there, and then that protective berm, that wall that wraps around the infrastructure there. And then finally, this last camera view here on the bottom left is from Thorbjorn looking to the southeast. You can see the northern edge of Grindavik there on the right, the black lava field from the January 14th eruption. There's that same greenhouse, and you can probably make out the berm there as well. So let's go ahead and get started with our update, looking at some of the data that I put together here over the last couple days. We'll start with the Met Office update. This is from yesterday, February 29th. It's very similar to the ones we've seen before, but a few little things have been updated here. So they mentioned that an eruption could start with very little warning, even less than 30 minutes. The location, or most likely location for the eruption, is that area we've been looking at between Hagafelt, which is just east of the power plant area, and then a little bit south of there. So Stora Stogafelt to Hagafelt, those two hills, those prominent areas there. In fact, let's just go ahead and show those real quick to give you a little bit of context. So here's the Svartsengi power plant, the Blue Lagoon. We can probably make those visible. There you go. The past eruptive site shown here in pink down here from the January 14th eruption, and in red and yellow, or I guess orange, from the December and February eruptions. So Hagafelt is this hill right here. Stora Stogafelt is this hill. And so somewhere in this region is the most likely location for the eruption. But we also, um, we also recognize that it could take place further south, like it did in January, or possibly a little bit further north. But this is the system and this is the region of interest that we're focused on. Going back to the Met Office update, um, it's possible that a dike intrusion occurs without resulting in a volcanic eruption. I think most people would put that as a less likely scenario, that we have an intrusion or a generation of a new magma body, a dike, without an eruption. We've already established a pathway for this magma to be transferred from the storage zone up to the surface. So it seems quite likely that that will happen again. So their model calculations are showing that there's been about almost about 9 million cubic meters of magma that's accumulated beneath the Spartsi area. The rate of inflation is fairly constant from day to day. In previous developments, the rate of inflation decreased shortly before an eruption began. So that's worth noting, that they saw a little bit of a downtick in that. According to model calculations, there's about 500,000 cubic meters of magma that's rising. That's the influx rate into the Svartsengi reservoir every 24 hours. So every day, that's how much more magma is intruding into the system, and that's why it's not a sustainable situation. At some point, that magma has nowhere else to go, and it'll find a pathway up to the surface. Um, and from our last several eruptions, we know that the critical threshold is anywhere between 8 to 3 million cubic meters of magma. And so we're in that zone right now, and that's why an eruption is considered imminent, any hour, day, within the next probably week or so. And then they talk about there could be very little warning time. And then the graphic here, which is nice, they've actually added the stars and the squares on it, which is nice. So the stars are the last three eruptions that we had, and then these are the days leading up to those events. So you can see the blue one here is um, the inflation prior to the December 18th eruption. So that one was the longest lived in terms of how many days it took in order to get an eruption, about 28 days. The purple one here was the events leading up to the November 10th event, which wasn't an eruption, but was an intrusion of magma and the formation of that dike off to the east. So that was a big event, and that was accompanied by a lot of earthquakes. That was the pathway being established, the pathway being widened, and that came with a lot of seismic activity as well. The green is the number of days and the path, or the magma volume versus days in leading up to the January 14th eruption. And then the yellow one is the February 8th eruption. So again, few data points here, small sample size, not statistically viable, but the trend is, again, based on 3 data points, which is not good statistics, but there is a trend here of fewer days to the eruption. So we had 28 days for the December eruption. We had about 25 days for the January eruption, about 23 days it looks like for the February eruption. So the red line is where we're at now. Where will this thing go? Will it get out to 23 plus days? Will it erupt prior to that? It's just wait and see. We'll have to see how that goes over the next couple days. The other thing the Met Office came out with was a new hazard map. Let's shrink that down a skosh so you can see that. And so they put out new hazard maps every week based on what's happening with the volcano. When we have an eruption, the hazard level drops a little bit because the magma is refilling. The threat of an eruption is less likely at that point, and so these zones tend to turn to yellow or orange. Now we've got a red zone here where we expect this next eruption to take place, just east and southeast of the power plant and north of the town of Godindavik. And then over here are the associated hazards with each zone. So in zone 3 here, the most likely area, we have eruptive fissures without warning, gases, tephra, just minor amounts of lava particles and minor amounts of ash possibly being thrown out, sinkholes, fault movements, lava flows, earthquakes, quite a bit of activity expected there. So not a good place to go pitch your tent and go camping for the next weekend or so, because there's likely to be some events happening there. So they came out with a new hazard map, as they do each week. And the hazard map's usually considered good until the next week unless there's a change in activity. So if there is an eruption or if things change, they can put out a new hazard map. And this just helps public officials manage the area, manage the zones, and actually know what the real threats are to the region. If we look at earthquakes over the past 24 hours, it's been pretty quiet. You can see the trend there. So this is 24 hours, and that's just not a lot of earthquakes. If we select down to 12 hours, it gets even smaller. And if we look at just the last 6 hours, very few earthquakes at all. But that's what we expect. We expect this eruption to take place with very little seismic activity preceding it. What we should see, though, even though these pathways excuse me, have been established, there should be a small flurry of low magnitude quakes in the minutes or hour or so leading up to that eruption as that pathway establishes itself all the way up to the surface. So those will probably be shallower quakes. So if you're watching this, you know, in live kind of real time data feed, you might see that, you might catch that flurry of earthquakes. Probably not hundreds of earthquakes, more like a few dozen or so that might take place preceding the eruption. The other thing we can talk about here while we're on the earthquake thing is there was another zone. Well, let's actually look at let's go to the Reykjanes area and look at a 15-day plot. Let's make that a little bigger. That way folks can see it. There we go. So this graph here shows the x-axis here is days. So the last 15 days, so going back to mid-February, and looking at the total number of earthquakes in this region per day. So you can see around 40 earthquakes per day, and then it dropped down for a day or two, then it went back up, then it kind of tapered down, then it ramped up, and then most recently here around the looks like the 25th, 26th, 27th of February, that came up and went as high as about 73 earthquakes a day. And then since that time, it's kind of trailed back down a little bit, but it's still at a slightly elevated level of 40-ish earthquakes per day. So that shows you what the earthquakes have been doing in this region over the last 2 weeks. If we look at magnitude, we can see that's the third graph down here. We can see mostly small quakes below 2. There was a 2.1 maybe about 4 or 5 days ago. And then we can look at the depth as well and see that a lot of these quakes are in this sort of 8 to 5 kilometer range. There's a bit of a zone here around 5 kilometers, and there's a secondary zone that's deeper. A lot of these deeper ones are actually probably some of these ones over here, to the east near the Fagradalsfjall area. That's where I had been seeing some of these deeper quakes. So in the area north of Godindavik, they tend to be shallower. 5 kilometers, there's 5 kilometers, there's 2.7, there's 1.1. So they do tend to be a little bit more shallow. There's 3, and then as you head over here, some of these tend to be a little deeper. These are all around 5 as well. Maybe these over here are some deeper ones. I'll have to see. Yeah, 4.6. I don't know. You have to look at them all collectively. So then the other thing that happened about 2 days ago, I didn't address it in the update on Wednesday, and maybe it hadn't even happened just yet, but there was a series of earthquakes. Let me cue you into the right area. So here's Reykjavik, the capital area, and here's Highway 1, the ring road, heading to the southeast. And in this area here, this is Hengil. There's a power plant here as well. It's a geothermal area. And they did have some earthquakes here. Now, this only goes back 24 hours, so you're not seeing a whole lot of quakes there, but there's one 2.2. But if we look at the Met Office data here in this map, that's that same area. You can see a cluster of quakes. This is for 48 hours, so this goes back to February 28th and 29th. So this is Wednesday to Friday. But there was a cluster of earthquakes there, and if we look at that cluster, you can see there was, again, this one that was around a 2.3 or so. One more that occurred today that was a little bit over 2. That's probably the one we saw there on this other map. So there was a series of earthquakes there, and obviously with everyone's sort of attention heightened and spidey senses on overload, and because it's in the same Reykjanes area, the obvious thought or question would be, well, is this related to the magmatic activity we're having around Godindavik? And I would say no. These are probably just tectonic quakes. This is also a geothermal system. There's nothing to suggest that this flurry of earthquakes, which seems to be pretty short-lived, and you can see that here. There was a little flurry on Wednesday, and undoubtedly people in the area might have felt some of these. Especially with this one that was near 3 in magnitude. But since then, it's really kind of tapered off. And so there's no reason to believe that these are related to magma intrusion. You can see there's some mapped faults on this map here. Those black lines are actually known and mapped faults in the area. So probably just tectonic quakes. Nothing to suggest that they're related to any movement of magma in the subsurface. GPS data for the last few days. We'll go to the Spartsi Station, which is one of the ones we tend to look at. So again, red dots just showing the elevation of this specific station over time. So you can see going through December, January, and February is pretty much ended now. So March should show up here soon, but this goes up to March 1st. That's what the little tick mark is. So here's our December 18th eruption that dropped the ground back down by releasing magma to the surface. That was followed by uplift. The January 14th one was a bit of an anomaly. It doesn't show the downdrop section here, and I need to look into that a little bit more. I have one viewer who thinks it might be related to the faulting on the Graben. I don't know if that's true though, because I don't think the station lies on the side of the Graben that was uplifted, but I need to look at that. Just something I haven't got to yet. But anyway, steady, more or less steady uplift as the magma was inflating, and then that culminated with the most recent eruption, which was February 8th. And then since then, you can see there's been some lulls here, but there still is uplift going on. In fact, if we get in there close in the nitty gritty and look at the last few data points, which is again small sample size theater, you can see an upward trend there. Again, there's error bars here. I'm not holding those as absolutes, but the overall trend is still slightly upward. So these rocks are still able to have some elasticity to them. They're able to deform and uplift the crust on the surface above as the magma continues to intrude. But at some point we should reach a breaking point, right, where the elastic limit of the crust in these rocks is reached, and that magma then is forced to fracture rock and find its way upward to the surface, or else find its way laterally to some other area. That's another possibility. It should lead to an eruption, but it doesn't necessarily have to lead to an eruption. If we look at a couple other stations, we have a couple other ones we've been looking at that show similar trends. This is another station near the power plant that nicely shows the December, January, and February eruptive events, and you can see just how much more we're good, maybe 60 millimeters, 6 centimeters above the elevation needed to trigger the February 8th eruption. And you can see this one shows maybe a little bit of this kind of stabilization going on here. But again, big error bars, hard to say for sure. Another one we've used in the past that has a nice little trend to it is the Blue Lagoon. And the Blue Lagoon GPS station really shows it flattening out. So at this station, it looks like ground deformation has stalled. Uplift is not happening for the most part, or at the same rate at this station. So that could be an interesting indicator. And then finally, just looking through some more of this data, if we go to the station off to the west at Elver, there is the 3 eruptions, and then here's our last little trend, a little bit of an uptick, but then the last couple days looks like kind of a little bit of stalling, maybe a slow upward movement there, but not as rapid as this little trend here or something we saw after the February 8th eruption. So things to keep an eye on. The GPS data won't really be a great indicator to really watch in terms of trying to see exactly when this eruption might take place. But it's something, it's one thing to look at. The earthquakes might be one way to look at this. And then really, because we just don't expect a lot of seismic activity, the first indication that this thing has erupted is most likely to be on the webcams. We'll just, if you're looking at if you're looking at the right webcam at the right time, you should see the eruption begin. I'm not saying stay home and just fixate yourself on the screen for hours and hours, but if you want to check in from time to time, these would be the ones where you should see it beginning until like word gets out and everyone knows that it's happening. Okay, so a couple other things. If you remember in my last update, we talked about different scenarios, and the Met Office had put together 2 scenarios. I showed you a couple maps with purple outlines on them, like exactly, they'd put together some scenarios of where this eruption could take place and exactly where that lava might flow. And one of our good viewers and contacts in Iceland, Eystein, he sent me, and now I got to find it. Oh, here we go. He said at that town hall meeting where the Met Office actually presented that data, that there was two other scenarios that did not get posted onto their website. And during my live stream, I had wondered why they picked those two. They did seem likely, but they obviously weren't the only possible scenarios out there. And so I think he just took some screenshots of the video and sent me some of the other maps that show possible eruptive scenarios. So I do want to share those with you. And the quality won't be quite as good as what we saw from the Met Office, but these might be a little bit helpful. So you can see, the screenshot there. There's the Met Office director. And let's just look at the map here. So it's the same parameters as the scenarios we looked at last time, where it's the same volume of magma, 600 cubic meters per second. It's the same duration of 6 hours. And so I guess this is scenario D in this instance. And the red line there shows where the eruption, this scenario, this hypothetical eruption would take place. So they've got it a little bit south and east of Hagafelt and very close to the protective barriers. And so they show that eruption occurring and the lava flowing around the protective barriers. And so some of that lava following this path to the southeast along the protective barrier, and then actually getting out into the ocean, which is pretty interesting. And I don't know if we've seen that in quite a while in Iceland. I'd have to kind of think quickly. Last time we saw lava flows going into the sea might be all the way back in the 70s at Heime. That might be the last time. But the other path of lava kind of wrapping around the hill here and then flowing to the southwest. Some of that lava does get into some of the peripheral neighborhoods and houses in this area and then ending here. So again, they have a limited amount of magma. They've dictated the discharge or the flow rate of the volume and then the duration. And so that might be what you would expect based on the defensive structures they have. They do show, it looks like a little bit of spillover in here. And so that's one little scenario right there. And then the other one that Aston shared with me, and this I guess is scenario, well, I don't know which one they labeled this one, but here's another scenario with an eruptive vent north of Hagafelt. And this one's interesting because it sends flows to the north and to the south. So this one's maybe a little bit more complicated, but we can see some of that flow gets channelized a little bit. There must be a little bit of a depression here. I think there's a smaller hill here. So some of that just comes down that ramp on the north side, fills in this flat area here. But then again, same parameters. Oh, there we go. Scenario B, I suppose. 600 cubic meters per second, 6 hours. And then that starts to wrap around this hill, Silingerfeld. And then you can see the old flow outlines in black out here. So those are the December and February flows. January flows down here in black. But you can see that kind of riding right on top of some of those February flows, right along the protective barrier for the Blue Lagoon. And the shades of purple are most likely in the deepest purple and least likely in the light shade of purple. And so the least, probability is that some of that lava maybe makes it to the parking lot area of the Blue Lagoon. Again, this is just based on lava volume and output for a specific period of time from a given location. But it does help them. The modeling is helpful to just see like, okay, where's this going to go? Let's pick a few likely fissure vent locations and see where this might go. And then from this to the south from this same fissure vent, everything's kind of wrapping around Hagafelt, this hill here, right along the roadway, and then running into the protective wall, and then a little lobe of it kind of makes its way to the edge of Grindavik in this scenario, but doesn't actually infiltrate the town much. And then more interestingly, here's a bigger channel that makes its way down the slope, stays to the east of Grindavik, and goes out to the ocean, similar to that last scenario. And then there's some small little channels and pathways. Looks like this little pathway does maybe take it through a few farms and buildings, so there would be a little bit of infrastructure there. But for the most part, that scenario plays out as low impact or minimal impact, I suppose, compared to some of the other ones. So thanks to ACE10 for providing that. That was something I didn't know because it wasn't on their the Met Office website, but something that was presented at the town meeting they had with residents. So very interesting. And then we'll wrap up here, team, with a couple news items that Amanda Joe sent me. So thanks as always to Amanda Joe for keeping me up to date on what's happening in Iceland. Hard to keep track of some of these things from thousands of kilometers away. And so here's Armand Höskuldsson. This is a volcanologist at University of Iceland. And in this article, which I'll post on the video description, he talks about that an eruption is more likely than just an intrusion of magma, or what they sometimes call in Iceland, it turns into this phrase magma run. So an eruption is most likely. Um, he says here, the way it looks now, it will definitely be an eruption rather than a magma flow or an intrusion. And if it occurs in the Sunduk crater series, it will be tonight or this weekend. So he's reiterating what everyone kind of thinks is that it's likely to happen any day now. He thinks it'll be similar to the February 8th eruption in terms of volume, and it will end quickly, so it'll only be maybe a day or so in terms of duration. And then, interestingly, the article ends with him, and I'll just read it because it's short. Arman has long been of the opinion that an eruption in Elverp is expected. So just to reiterate any new listeners here, so everything's going on here north and northeast of Grindavik, but off to the west we have this older volcanic system. You can see, if I take out the red line, you can see this chain of craters and fissures that erupted 800 to 1200 years ago, something like that. And this has been maintained by not just him, but and I asked Professor Thordarson about it as well. And there's just been so many Icelandic volcanologists that are just seem so adamant about these vents being reoccupied by what's happening here. And I'm not dismissing that that's not a possibility, but until we see earthquakes and some signs of magma migration from this area towards this system, I just don't know how we would draw that conclusion just yet. Right now, we have this magma body somewhere in here, and it's established clear pathways 4 times now over into this region to the east, and so that seems a much more likely proposition. But nonetheless, he says, just to finish out here, um, he's long been of the opinion that an eruption there is expected, but at what point it will happen is not good to say, so we can't say when. The last eruption in the area was in the 13th century, so again, 900 years ago. He says it ends in Elvert, where the middle is in the plate junctions, and then this chain of events stops in the Sunnakur crater series. He says that volcanic eruptions in Elvert will then probably last longer and be larger in size. It's easier for the magma to go up there when it finally gets there, and I fully expect that if it starts erupting at Elvert, then we'll have repeated events like the eruptions in the Sunnakur crater series. So, interesting assertion. Again, I don't dispute it. I just am curious to know what evidence he's using for those claims. That would just be interesting. And maybe I'll reach out to him like I did with Professor Thordarson and get his take on that. I think that would be interesting. And then finally, this article just talks about that there's a lot of dangers in Grindavik, and even though they've let the residents back in and people are staying at the Blue Lagoon Hotel, that it's not recommended for anyone in this immediate vicinity to be staying overnight. And they talk a little bit about how much more difficult it is to evacuate people at night, especially with short notice. It's dark. It's kind of hard to see what's going on. The human nature would be, I need to grab some stuff. I'm not ready. I'm not dressed. And it really, depending on where this vent opens up, it really could be a matter of minutes that you have to evacuate and get to a safer location. But the town sits in a low area, and that's likely to be where lava tries to go. It's also a place where the vents could open up, which is interesting and alarming. So, and then we'll just go back to the live view real quick and make sure. Yep, in the last few minutes that we were talking, it looks like there was not an eruption, but we can kind of keep watching that, I suppose. So, a couple other things just to share with you, and then we'll wrap this one up. Quick funny story that happened on Wednesday. So we did the drone flight with Nature Eye over the eruption area, and I guess I can pull up the map and show you where we actually launched from and such. So Johan, our drone chief there took this little road up to this area. So this is where he was based at. And then we ended up flying right over the top of Stora Stogafelt, came over to here, wrapped around a little bit into this area, then flew out to near the road and then came back. But while he was out there, I actually got well, a few hours after the live stream, I got an email from a viewer who was in Iceland, and he's also a photographer, and he was with a friend, and they thought they would get as close as they could and try to take some pictures, and maybe be there for something if it were to happen. So they were actually here, and he talked about that they kind of had the place to themselves for the most part, and then this car drove up and a young gentleman jumped out and started putting up a antenna and connecting wires to things, and then pulled out a drone, and it was actually Johan. So there was one of our teammates here, a viewer named Steve. Yeah, Steve Evans actually was there with Johan. So he said it was kind of fun to see some behind the scenes footage, I suppose, or behind the scenes view of what actually took place when we do those drone flights and live streams. I'll see if I can get a few photos from him. It would be neat to see, what things look like from Johan's point of view while we're doing those drone flights and live streams. And I'll try to share those with you if I can get those from him. I think that would be kind of fun and neat. So, and a couple other things. I have Amanda Joe. We're going to do an interview with her sometime, hopefully in the next week or so. Kind of waiting to see, if the eruption happens soon. I want to give some space for that. And then once the eruption has settled down, which might be quite quickly, we can do an interview with Amanda Joe, who still owns property in Grindavik officially and lived through some of the action that took place on November 10th, and maybe talk to her about her experiences there. She was willing to do that. So that's something to look forward to. And then also, a lot of you might be familiar with another really great YouTube channel called Just Icelandic. And the gentleman who runs that is named Gylfi. And he has been working a little bit with Amanda Joe. They went out, I think, yesterday and did some filming in the area. And he has agreed to work with me. And also, I'm going to do an interview with him and actually talk a little bit about his story, his connection to the town, some of the great footage he's trying to get through drones and thermal drones, and just have a conversation. And so look forward to that as well. That's not scheduled as of yet, but something that we have in the hopper. And then finally, this Sunday, so in 2 days, March 3rd, at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, which would be 5 p.m. in Iceland, GMT, we will have a very special live stream broadcast with Nick Zentner, who is a very prominent and popular American geologist who has all sorts of geology education programming, has his own YouTube channel just like I do. Was a bit of an inspiration to me when I first kind of got started with this. And even though we kind of do things very differently and have our own little niches carved out, I suppose, he is scheduled to do an interview with me this Sunday. So please try to tune in for that if you can. I was on his program a few weeks ago talking about the Bonneville flood. And so this is him just paying me back a little bit and reciprocating. So that'll be great fun. So hopefully this update was helpful. We'll see what happens. Next time I talk to you could very well be immediately after the eruption takes place. My weekend is pretty open, so if something happens over the weekend, I'll try to get with you as quick as I can. With my darn luck, it'll be an eruption that takes place at 2 in the morning, and then my phone's pinging and I'm groggy and not really wanting to get up, but still wanting to get up because there's an eruption happening. So we'll just see what happens. But be well. Thanks so much, team, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.